There are places in this world where the law doesn't reach. Places where the fog rolls thick over black water, where cypress trees stand like silent witnesses to unspeakable things, and where a man's scream can echo for miles without ever reaching civilized ears. The Louisiana Bayou is one of those places. And in the 1920s, it belonged to one man, a man whose name was whispered with the same reverence reserved for the devil himself, Étienne LaSalle. They called him the Bayou Butcher, though never to his face. To his face, you called him Monsieur. Or you called him nothing at all, because speaking out of turn in his presence was the last mistake you'd ever make. This is not a story about a common criminal. This is the tale of an empire built on blood, swamp water, and the kind of ambition that doesn't ask for permission. It takes what it wants and buries the evidence where nobody will ever find it before. We descend into the darkness of Étienne's world. I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it in your corner of the world? Are you tucked away in bed, listening to this story as shadows dance on your walls? Or perhaps you're somewhere else entirely, drawn to tales of men who lived by their own rules and died by them too. Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're ready to journey into the murky depths of one of America's most ruthless criminal empires, then settle in. This is going to be a long night. Every monster has an origin story, and Étienne LaSalle's began in the steaming summer of 1891, in a shack so close to the bayou that the floorboards stayed perpetually damp. He was born to a Creole mother who cleaned houses for white families in New Orleans, and a father he never knew. Some said the man was a riverboat gambler. Others claimed he was a preacher who couldn't resist the bottle or the flesh. The truth died with Étienne's mother when yellow fever swept through their parish and left the 7-year-old boy standing over her grave, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a rage that would never fully extinguish. The bayou raised him after that. Not people, the bayou itself. Étienne learned to fish before he could write his name. He learned to hunt alligators with nothing but a knife and nerves of steel. He learned which plants could heal and which could kill, which waters were safe, and which concealed cottonmouths coiled in waiting. Most importantly, he learned that in the swamp, only the strong survived, and mercy was a luxury that got you killed. By the time he was 14, Étienne had already killed his first man. It wasn't planned, not exactly. There was a trapper named Boudreaux, a massive Cajun with hands like ham hocks and a temper shorter than a rattlesnake's patience. Boudreaux had accused young Étienne of stealing from his traps, an accusation that happened to be true, but that didn't matter in the lawless stretches of the bayou. What mattered was that Boudreaux came at the boy with a skinning knife. And what Boudreaux didn't know was that this wasn't just any boy. Étienne was smaller, quicker, and infinitely more willing to do what needed to be done. When Boudreaux lunged, Étienne sidestepped like a dancer and brought his own blade across the big man's throat with a precision that shocked even himself. Boudreaux fell into the black water, and the gators took care of the rest. Étienne stood there on the bank, watching the water turn red then black again, and something crystallized in his young mind. Power didn't come from being the biggest or the loudest. Power came from being the one willing to go further than anyone else. The years that followed shaped him, like a blacksmith shapes iron with heat and force and repeated striking. Étienne worked the docks in New Orleans, where he saw how the city's underworld operated. He watched the Italian gangs control the waterfront, the Irish gangs run the saloons, and the wealthy white men who pulled all the strings from their mansions in the Garden District. He studied them the way a predator studies prey, learning their weaknesses, their tells, their hierarchies. But it was during Prohibition, when the Volstead Act turned alcohol into liquid gold, that Étienne saw his real opportunity. While everyone else was looking at the cities, Chicago, New York, Kansas City, Étienne looked at the map and saw something they didn't. The bayou. Hundreds of miles of navigable waterways, countless hidden channels, and land so remote that federal agents wouldn't dare venture into it even if they knew it existed. The bayou could be a highway for smuggling rum from the Caribbean, whiskey from Canada, anything the thirsty American public wanted. All it needed was someone ruthless enough to control it. Étienne LaSalle was that someone. He started small, running rum from Cuban suppliers up through the Gulf of Mexico and into the labyrinth of Louisiana's waterways. He used boats so shallow they could navigate waters where bigger vessels would run aground. He employed men who knew the bayou like their own reflection, Cajuns, Creoles, mixed-race outcasts who'd been ignored by society and were hungry for the money Étienne offered. More than that, he offered them something the world had denied them: respect, or at least the fear that resembled it. His operation grew quickly, but so did the attention. Other smugglers tried to muscle in on his territory. The first crew that tried, a group of Texas bootleggers who thought the swamp was empty for the taking, disappeared without a trace. Search parties found their boats a week later, drifting empty except for bloodstains and bullet holes. The second crew met a worse fate. They were found, or parts of them were, hung from cypress trees along a well-traveled channel as a message. The message was received. Étienne wasn't just building a business, he was building a mythology. Stories spread through the underworld about the Bayou Butcher, the man who fed his enemies to alligators, who could navigate the swamp in complete darkness, who had eyes everywhere and forgot nothing. Some stories were true. Others Étienne started himself, understanding that fear was the most valuable currency in his line of work. A man too afraid to challenge you was a man you never had to fight, but Étienne wasn't satisfied with just smuggling. He saw how much money flowed through New Orleans, from the jazz clubs on Bourbon Street to the gambling dens in Storyville to the whorehouses that never closed. The city was a gold mine, and the bayou was his bank vault. He began expanding, first taking control of distribution networks in New Orleans, then the speakeasies and blind pigs that served his product. He was careful, methodical, always working through intermediaries, never exposing himself directly to law enforcement. By 1925, Étienne LaSalle controlled the flow of illegal liquor through Louisiana and into Mississippi, Alabama, and eastern Texas. He had politicians on his payroll, police captains who looked the other way, judges who dismissed charges against his men. He lived in a sprawling estate deep in the bayou, accessible only by boat, surrounded by armed guards and loyal followers who would die for him without question. Some did, but even as his empire grew, Étienne remained the same cold, calculating predator who'd slit Boudreaux's throat all those years ago. He trusted no one completely. He slept lightly, with a loaded pistol under his pillow and a knife strapped to his calf. He knew that in his world, today's lieutenant could be tomorrow's assassin. That loyalty was purchased, not earned, and that the moment he showed weakness would be the moment someone tried to take everything he'd built. Asterisk, asterisk. What Étienne didn't know what. He couldn't have known as he sat in his bayou fortress, counting his money and planning his next expansion, was that the seeds of his destruction had already been planted. Not by rival gangsters or federal agents, but by something far more dangerous, his own success. The higher you climb, the further. You have to fall, and Étienne LaSalle had climbed very high indeed. The monster had been made. The empire had been built. Now came the part of the story where both would be tested in ways that even Étienne, for all his cunning and cruelty, could never have anticipated. Asterisk, asterisk. Success in the criminal underworld is like blood in the water. Asterisk, asterisk. Success in the criminal underworld is like blood in the water world. Is like blood in the water it attracts sharks. By 1926, Étienne LaSalle's operation was pulling in money at a rate that made even the biggest crime. Families in Chicago and New York take notice. And with that notice came something inevitable: competition, betrayal, and violence on a scale that would make the Bayou Run red dot. The first real threat came from an unexpected direction. His name was Vincent Marcello, and he was everything Étienne was not. Where Étienne was cold and calculating, Vincent was hot-tempered and impulsive. Where Étienne had built his empire from nothing, Vincent had inherited his position in New Orleans' Italian crime family, the organization that had controlled the city's rackets long before Prohibition made alcohol illegal. Vincent was young, ambitious, and stupid enough to believe that his family name made him untouchable. It started with small things. A shipment of Étienne's rum mysteriously disappearing from a warehouse in the French Quarter. One of his speakeasies getting raided by police who'd supposedly been paid off. A distributor who suddenly refused to carry LaSalle liquor, claiming he'd gotten a better offer. Étienne recognized these moves for what they were: probes, tests to see how he'd respond, to gauge whether the Bayou Butcher was as dangerous as his reputation suggested. Étienne's response was measured and brutal. The warehouse thieves were found floating in the Mississippi River, their bodies weighted down with chains, but not quite enough to keep them submerged. Étienne wanted them found. The corrupt police officers who'd conducted the raid received packages at their homes containing photographs of their families and a simple message: next time. The distributor who'd switched allegiances was given a choice: return to the fold or retire permanently. He chose retirement, moving his family to Texas and never speaking of New Orleans again. But Vincent Marcello didn't get the message. Or perhaps he did and simply didn't care. In the spring of 1926, Vincent made his play. He orchestrated a coordinated attack on 3 of Étienne's major operations simultaneously. A rum-running boat was ambushed and sunk in the Gulf. A warehouse in Baton Rouge was burned to the ground. And most damaging of all, Vincent's men massacred a crew of Étienne's smugglers in broad daylight in New Orleans' train neighborhood, leaving 5 men dead in the street. This wasn't a probe anymore. This was war. The city held its breath, waiting to see how the Bayou Butcher would respond. The old-timers who remembered the brutal gang wars of the 1890s began stocking up on supplies, knowing that when men like Étienne LaSalle and Vincent Marcello went to war, innocent people often got caught in the crossfire. The police braced for a bloodbath. Even the mayor, corrupt as he was, tried to broker a peace meeting between the two factions. Étienne attended the meeting, held in a neutral speakeasy owned by a third party. He sat across from Vincent Marcello, this young lion who thought he could take the throne from the king of the bayou, and he listened patiently as Vincent outlined his terms. Étienne would cede control of all New Orleans operations to the Marcello family, limiting himself to the bayou and rural parishes, and in exchange, Vincent would allow him to continue his rum-running as long as he paid a percentage to the Marcellos. The room was silent when Vincent finished speaking. Everyone waited for Étienne's response. The Bayou Butcher studied his adversary with eyes that revealed nothing. Then he smiled, and those who knew him felt their blood run cold, because Étienne LaSalle only smiled before he killed. "No," Étienne said simply, and stood up and walked out. What followed was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare applied to organized crime. Étienne didn't go after Vincent directly. That would be expected, and Étienne never did what was expected. Instead, he went after the Marcello family's infrastructure with surgical precision. He used his intimate knowledge of the bayou to cut off their supply routes. He bribed their suppliers to refuse shipments. He had his men pose as federal agents and raid Marcello operations, confiscating product and money that went straight into Étienne's coffers. Most devastatingly, Étienne turned the Marcello family's own soldiers against them. He'd spent years building relationships with the working men of New Orleans, the dock workers, the warehouse employees, the drivers and guards who actually made the criminal enterprises function. These men had no particular loyalty to Vincent Marcello, who treated them as expendable. Étienne offered them better pay, better treatment, and most importantly, better security. Within weeks, Vincent was hemorrhaging men to LaSalle's Operation Vincent responded with increasing violence and decreasing effectiveness. He sent assassins after Étienne, but they disappeared into the bayou and were never seen again. He tried to ambush LaSalle's shipments, but somehow Étienne always knew where the ambushes would be and rerouted accordingly. It was as if Étienne had eyes everywhere, which in a sense he did. He'd placed informants throughout the Marcello organization, even within Vincent's inner circle. The turning point came on a hot July night in 1926. Vincent Marcello was dining at a restaurant in the French Quarter, surrounded by his top lieutenants and a dozen armed guards. He believed he was safe, protected by his men and his family name. He was wrong. Étienne's men didn't storm the restaurant or stage a shootout. That would have been crude, messy, and exactly what Vincent expected. Instead, they waited until Vincent and his men emerged from the restaurant, drunk and laughing, convinced of their own invincibility. As they walked to their cars, the street lights suddenly went dark. Étienne had men inside the power company. In the darkness, gunfire erupted from multiple directions. When the lights came back on minutes later, Vincent Marcello lay dead on the sidewalk with 3 bullets in his chest. 4 of his lieutenants were dead beside him. The rest of his men had fled, and the guards who'd been stationed outside the restaurant were nowhere to be found. They'd been paid off by LaSalle and had simply walked away. The message was clear. There was nowhere Vincent could go, no protection that could save him, no amount of family power that could match what Étienne LaSalle had built. The Bayou Butcher had proven that he was not just a swamp rat who got lucky. He was a criminal mastermind who could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast anyone who challenged him. But the war with Vincent Marcello though decisively won, had costs that Étienne hadn't fully anticipated. The violence had drawn federal attention in a way that his previous operations hadn't. The Bureau of Prohibition, which had largely ignored Louisiana in favor of larger cities, now had agents sniffing around New Orleans. Worse, the newspapers had started writing about the gang war, and public pressure was mounting for anyone to do something about the lawlessness. Étienne retreated to his Bayou fortress to consolidate his gains and plan his next moves. He'd won the battle, but he knew the war was far from over. The federal government was a different enemy than Vincent Marcello, bigger, better funded, and theoretically incorruptible, though Étienne had his doubts about that last part. He'd corrupted plenty of incorruptible men in his time. As he sat on the porch of his estate, watching the sun set over the black water, Étienne reflected on how far he'd come and how far he still wanted to go. He controlled the liquor trade throughout the Deep South. He had politicians, police, and judges on his payroll. He was richer than he'd ever imagined possible when he was that starving boy standing over his mother's grave. But he wasn't satisfied. Satisfaction was for weak men, for men who didn't have the vision to see what could be. Étienne LaSalle saw an empire that could stretch beyond Louisiana, beyond the South, all the way to the biggest cities in America. He saw himself as more than a bootlegger. He saw himself as a king. What he couldn't see in his arrogance and ambition, was the betrayal already taking shape within his own organization. Because while Étienne had been focused on Vincent Marcello and the external threats to his empire, something far more dangerous had been growing in the shadows. One of his own men, someone he trusted, someone close enough to know all his secrets, had decided that maybe it was time for a new king in the Bayou. The blood in the water had attracted sharks, and Étienne had defeated them. But sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one swimming right beside you, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Asterisk, asterisk. They say that paranoia is just heightened awareness in a world where everyone really is out to get you. Étienne LaSalle had always been paranoid. It was one of the qualities that had kept him alive this long. But in the aftermath of his war with the Marcellos, that paranoia reached new heights. He trusted no one completely, questioned everything, and slept even less than before. His instincts were screaming that something was wrong, but he couldn't identify the threat. It was like feeling a gator beneath the water, but not knowing exactly where it would surface. The threat had a name. Jacques Thibodeau. Jacques was one of Étienne's original men, recruited back in the early days when the operation was just a few boats and a dream. He was Cajun through and through, spoke English with an accent so thick that outsiders could barely understand him, and he knew the bayou almost as well as Étienne himself. More importantly, Jacques had proven his loyalty time and again. He'd killed for Étienne. He'd been shot for Étienne. He'd spent 6 months in a Louisiana prison, refusing to talk even when the police beat him daily. Étienne trusted Jacques more than he trusted anyone, which was his first mistake. The second mistake was not seeing what should have been obvious. Jacques was ambitious. Not in the loud, obvious way that Vincent Marcello had been ambitious, but in the quiet, patient way that made him far more dangerous. Jacques had watched Étienne build an empire from nothing, and over the years, a simple thought had taken root in his mind and grown like a cancer. If Étienne could do it, why couldn't he? Jacques began his betrayal the way all smart traders do, slowly, carefully, making sure each step was secure before taking the next. He started cultivating relationships with Étienne's men, the soldiers and drivers and guards who actually ran the day-to-day operations. He bought them drinks, listened to their complaints about Étienne's leadership, commiserated when bonuses were smaller than expected. He was subtle about it, never openly criticizing the boss, but planting seeds of doubt and discontent that would grow in fertile soil. He also began building his own network outside of Étienne's organization. He made contact with suppliers in Cuba and Mexico who were eager to work with someone other than LaSalle. He reached out to speakeasy owners who resented the percentage Étienne demanded. He even opened a channel of communication with what remained of the Marcello family, suggesting that perhaps they could do business together if certain circumstances changed. But Jacques' masterstroke was something Étienne never saw coming. He befriended Marie Broussard. Marie was Étienne's woman, though that term didn't quite capture what she was to him. She wasn't a wife. Étienne had never married, considering it a dangerous vulnerability, but she was more than a mistress. Marie was a former brothel girl from Storyville, beautiful and cunning and tough as nails. She'd caught Étienne's eye back in 1923, and somehow she'd managed to do what no one else had. She'd gotten close to him. Not close enough that he told her everything, but close enough that she lived in his Bayou estate, close enough that she knew his routines, close enough that she'd borne him a son in 1925. The son complicated things. Étienne LaSalle, who'd never cared about legacy or family or anything beyond the accumulation of power and money, found himself softening toward the boy. He'd hold his son on the porch of the estate and tell him stories about the bayou, about survival, about strength. For the first time in his life, Étienne was thinking about the future beyond his own lifespan. He even began to imagine his son taking over the empire one day, continuing what he'd built. Jacques saw all of this, and he understood what it meant. Étienne was vulnerable. The child was a weakness, and Marie was the pathway to that weakness. Seducing Marie wasn't difficult. She was young, bored, and trapped in a gilded cage in the middle of the swamp with a man who, despite his recent softness toward their son, remained cold and distant toward her. Jacques was charming, attentive, and most importantly, present. While Étienne was away managing his empire, Jacques was there, talking to Marie, making her laugh, making her feel seen. The affair began in late 1926, and by early 1927, Jacques had Marie convinced that she and their son would have a better life with him than with Étienne. The plan was simple in concept, difficult in execution. Jacques would orchestrate a coup, killing Étienne and taking control of the organization. Those loyal to Étienne would be given a choice: swear allegiance to the new boss or join the old boss in death. The timing would be crucial. It had to happen when Étienne was vulnerable, when his guard was down. In a place where Jacquemin outnumbered Étienne's, the opportunity came in March of 1927. Étienne was hosting a meeting at his Bayou estate with his top lieutenants to discuss expansion into Florida. It would be the largest gathering of LaSalle leadership in one place, and Jacques, as one of Étienne's most trusted men, would naturally be in attendance. Jacques spent weeks preparing, identifying which men at the meeting would side with him, positioning his own loyalists as guards around the estate. even arranging for certain of Étienne's most dangerous supporters to be conveniently called away. On urgent business the day of the meeting, the night before the meeting, Jacques lay in bed with Marie in a cabin a few miles from Étienne's estate. She was nervous, worried about what would happen to her son in the chaos of the coup. Jacques reassured her, promised her that the boy would be safe, that they'd raise him together as their own. What Jacques didn't tell Marie was that he had no intention of letting Étienne's son live. The boy would always be a rallying point for LaSalle loyalists, always a threat to Jacques' rule. The child would have to die with his father, but Étienne LaSalle hadn't survived this long by being easy to kill. Despite all of Jacques' careful planning, despite the network of traitors and the compromised security and the perfect setup, Étienne's paranoia saved his life. That morning, something felt wrong to him. He couldn't articulate what it was, maybe the way Jacques had looked at him the day before. Maybe the fact that 3 of his most loyal men had all been called away on business simultaneously. Maybe just the instinct that had kept him alive through 2 decades of violence. Whatever it was, Étienne decided to trust it. An hour before the meeting was scheduled to start, he had his personal guardsmen who'd been with him since the beginning, men whose loyalty he'd purchased with more than money, quietly seal all the exits to the estate. Then he walked into the meeting room and locked the door behind him. 14 men were in that room. Étienne stood at the head of the table, and for a long moment he just studied their faces. He could see it now, the tells he'd missed before. Jacques wasn't meeting his eyes. 3 of the other men kept glancing at Jacques, waiting for a signal. 2 more were sweating despite the room being cool. The math was simple and damning. At least 6 of the 14 men in this room were traitors. Who wants to tell me what's really going on? Étienne asked quietly. The room erupted. Jacques went for his gun, but Étienne was faster. He'd been expecting it. Étienne's bullet caught Jacques in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol skittering across the floor. The other traitors reached for their weapons, but Étienne's loyal men were already moving. Gunfire filled the room, deafening. In the enclosed space, when the smoke cleared seconds later, 5 men lay dead or dying on the floor. Jacques was bleeding but alive, pressed against the wall with Étienne's gun against his temple. "Why?" Étienne asked, and there was something in his voice, not anger, not betrayal, just a cold curiosity about what could make a man throw away everything for a play at power. Jacques laughed, blood bubbling from his lips. "Because you're weak now, Étienne. Weak for that woman and that brat. I would have made this empire greater than you ever could." Étienne's expression didn't change. "Where's Marie?" Jacques' smile told him everything he needed to know. Étienne pistol whipped Jacques unconscious and left him bleeding on the floor. He took 3 of his loyal men and went to find Marie and his son. They found her at Jacques' cabin, packing her things, preparing to run. When she saw Étienne in the doorway, she knew it was over. She tried to explain, to justify, to beg, but Étienne wasn't interested in her words. He only had one question. "Did you love him?" Marie looked at the man who'd given her everything and taken away her freedom, the father of her child, the most dangerous man in Louisiana, and she told him the truth. "Yes," Étienne nodded slowly. He looked at his son, sleeping peacefully in a cradle near the bed, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. For a moment, something human flickered across Étienne's face, pain, loss, something almost like grief. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold mask he'd worn for so long it had become his real face. "Get out of Louisiana," he told Marie. "Take money from the cabin safe. Go far away and never come back. If I ever see you again, I'll kill you. If you ever try to contact our son, I'll kill you. Do you understand?" Marie nodded, crying, and began throwing clothes into a bag with shaking hands. Étienne watched her for a moment, then turned to his men. "Make sure she gets on a train north. After that, she's not our concern." Back at the estate, Étienne dealt with the traitors in a way that would become legend in Louisiana's criminal underworld. He had Jacques and the two surviving conspirators taken deep into the bayou, to a place where the water was black and still, and the cypress trees grew so thick that sunlight barely penetrated. He had them tied to the trees at water level, close. Enough that when the tide came in, and it always came in, they would drown slowly, gasping for air as the water rose inch by inch over their faces. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Étienne left them there alive long enough for the gators to smell the blood from their wounds. They say you could hear the screaming for miles. They say that for weeks afterward, fishermen avoided that part of the bayou, spooked by the sounds of thrashing in the water and the sight of red-stained trees. They say that Étienne went back to his estate, locked himself in his study with a bottle of rum, and didn't emerge for 3 days. When he did finally emerge, something had changed. The brief softness that fatherhood had brought out in him was gone, burned away by betrayal. He'd sent his son away to be raised by a trusted family in Texas, unable to look at the boy without seeing Marie's betrayal. The Bayou Butcher was harder now, colder, more ruthless than ever before. He'd learned a terrible lesson. That trust was a liability, that even love was a weapon that could be used against you, that the only person you could truly rely on was yourself. The purge of traitors continued for weeks. Étienne went through his organization with surgical precision, removing anyone he had even the slightest doubt about. Some he killed. Others he simply cut loose, exiling them from Louisiana with warnings about what would happen if they ever returned. By the time he was finished, his operation was smaller but infinitely more loyal. Those who remained understood that Étienne LaSalle was not a man to be betrayed, ever. The throne was secure again, but it had required blood to secure it. And Étienne, sitting alone in his bayou fortress with his son gone and his woman exiled, and half his organization dead or scattered, had to wonder, what exactly had he won? He had power, yes. He had money, certainly. But he also had exactly what he'd always had, himself, alone, trusting no one, loved by no one, feared by everyone. The knife that had been aimed at his back had missed, but in defending himself, Étienne had cut away everything that had made him human. What remained was the monster he'd been creating since he was 7 years old, standing over his mother's grave. The monster was all there was now. The monster was all there would ever be. The betrayal of Jacques Thibodeau changed Étienne LaSalle in ways that rippled through his organization like a stone thrown into still water. By 1928, the Bayou Butcher had rebuilt his empire into something leaner, meaner, and more efficient than before. But it was also colder, more paranoid, and increasingly isolated from the very communities that had once supported it. Étienne's response to betrayal was to eliminate all possible vulnerability, which meant eliminating all possible humanity. He no longer met with his lieutenants face to face except in the most controlled circumstances. He communicated through intermediaries, dead drops, and coded messages. He moved between safe houses throughout the bayou, never sleeping in the same place more than 2 nights in a row. His men reported to men who reported to men who reported to him, creating layers of insulation between Étienne and anyone who might want him dead. This strategy kept him alive, but it also meant he was losing touch with the ground-level reality of his operation. He didn't see the resentment building among his workers, who felt more like cogs in a machine than members of an organization. He didn't notice when federal agents began making real progress in their investigation of his smuggling routes. He didn't realize that his quest for absolute security was creating the very conditions that would eventually destroy him, but in 1928, all of that was still in the future. For now, Étienne was focused on expansion and consolidation. Prohibition was in full swing. The demand for illegal alcohol was insatiable, and the money was flowing like the Mississippi River after spring rains. Étienne had operations in 7 states, controlled dozens of speakeasies and blind pigs, and had enough politicians and lawmen on his payroll that he felt practically untouchable. His primary competition now wasn't local gangs, but the big national organizations: the Chicago Outfit, the New York Families, the Detroit Purple Gang. These organizations looked at the South and saw untapped potential, and they looked at Étienne LaSalle and saw an obstacle to be removed. Throughout 1928 and 1929, there were feelers, threats, and occasionally violence as these larger operations tried to muscle in on LaSalle territory. Étienne met these challenges the same way he met all challenges, with overwhelming, brutal force. When Chicago sent representatives to negotiate his surrender of Mississippi territory, those representatives disappeared into the bayou. When Detroit tried to undercut his prices, Étienne flooded the market with such cheap liquor that the Purple Gang's operation became unsustainable, and they withdrew. When New York attempted to bribe away his suppliers, Étienne responded by hijacking a shipment of New York liquor and distributing it free to every speakeasy in New Orleans. The message was always the same: Louisiana belonged to Étienne LaSalle, and anyone who forgot that would be reminded in the most permanent way possible. But while Étienne was fighting off external threats, something far more dangerous was developing internally. His organization was becoming too big to hide. The Bureau of Prohibition had established a major field office in New Orleans, and they'd assigned their best agent to the LaSalle case. His name was Thomas Brennan, and he was everything that Étienne wasn't: idealistic, incorruptible, and absolutely committed to the rule of law. Brennan was an Irish Catholic from Boston, a former Marine who'd served in France during the Great War and come home with medals and a burning desire to make America live up to its ideals. He genuinely believed in Prohibition, saw it as a moral crusade rather than just a job. More dangerously, he couldn't be bought. Étienne tried. Of course, everyone had a price. But Brennan's price wasn't money or power or women. Brennan wanted to see criminals like Étienne LaSalle behind bars, and he was willing to dedicate his life to making that happen. For the first time in years, Étienne faced an opponent who couldn't be intimidated, bribed, or killed without bringing down massive retaliation. Killing a federal agent was a line that even the most powerful gangsters rarely crossed, because it brought heat that no amount of political protection could deflect. Brennan knew this, and he used it to his advantage, pressing his investigation harder than any local law enforcement officer would dare. Brennan's strategy was methodical and patient. He couldn't get to Étienne directly. The man was too insulated, too protected. But he could chip away at the organization from the bottom up. He started making arrests of low-level smugglers and runners, offering them deals if they'd testify against their bosses. Most refused, more afraid of LaSalle justice than federal prison. But some took the deals, and slowly, Brennan began piecing together the structure of Étienne's empire. By late 1929, Brennan had enough evidence to start going after Étienne's lieutenants. He secured indictments against 3 of them on federal conspiracy charges. 2 fled the jurisdiction before they could be arrested. The third, a man named LeBlanc, who'd been with Étienne for nearly a decade, made the fatal mistake of assuming his boss would protect him. He stayed, was arrested, and stood trial. The trial was a sensation in New Orleans. For the first time, the public was hearing detailed testimony about how LaSalle's organization operated, the smuggling routes, the payoffs, the violence. Étienne watched from a distance, furious but unable to intervene without exposing himself. LeBlanc kept his mouth shut about Étienne specifically, but the trial painted such a vivid picture of the organization that it didn't matter. Everyone knew who was really on trial. LeBlanc was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He lasted 3 weeks before being found dead in his cell, stabbed 23 times with a sharpened spoon. The official investigation concluded it was a gang killing, though they could never prove who'd ordered it. They didn't need to prove it. Everyone knew, but LeBlanc's death, meant to send a message about the cost of cooperation, actually had the opposite effect. It showed the remaining members of LaSalle's organization that Étienne's protection only extended so far. If you got arrested, you were on your own, and if you looked like you might talk, you were dead. This wasn't loyalty, it was terrorism. And it made some of Étienne's men start thinking about their options. Asterisk, asterisk. One of those men was a smuggler named Bert, who'd been running boats for Étienne since 1925. Bert had a wife and 3 children, and the older he got, the more he thought about what would happen to them if he ended up like LeBlanc. When Brennan approached him with an offer full immunity in exchange for testimony, Bert wrestled with his conscience for 3 days. Then he looked at his children and made his choice. Bert's testimony was devastating. Unlike LeBlanc, who'd kept Étienne's name out of court, Bert gave Brennan everything: dates, locations, names, and most importantly, direct evidence linking Étienne LaSalle to specific criminal acts. Bert had kept records, receipts, and correspondence that he'd hidden away as insurance. Now he turned it all over to the federal government. Étienne learned about Bert's betrayal from one of his informants in the New Orleans Police Department. His response was immediate and terrifying. Bert had been moved to a safe house outside the city, guarded by federal marshals. Étienne sent a team of his best men not to kill Bert, which would be impossible with federal protection, but to send a message. They went to Bert's home, where his wife and children were staying with relatives, under the assumption they'd be safe since they weren't in witness protection. What happened next Depends on who tells the story. The official record says that armed intruders broke into the house in the middle of the night, terrorized the family, and burned the house to the ground. Ebert's wife and children escaped physically unharmed, but the psychological trauma was severe. The unofficial story, the one whispered in the underworld, was darker. That Étienne's men gave Ebert's wife a message to pass along. Tell your husband that he can testify, but his family will pay for every word. Ebert got the message. He also got a backbone that Étienne hadn't anticipated. Instead of recanting his testimony, Ebert doubled down. He told Brennan everything, including about the attack on his family. He testified in such detail and with such specificity that when he was done, Brennan had enough evidence to indict Étienne LaSalle on 17 different federal charges, ranging from conspiracy to violate the Volstead Act to interstate transportation of stolen goods to ordering multiple murders. The indictment came down in January of 1930, and for the first time in his criminal career, Étienne LaSalle was officially a wanted man. Federal arrest warrants were issued. His photograph appeared in newspapers across the South. Agents raided his known properties, though Étienne had vanished into the bayou long before they arrived. The net was closing, and for the first time since he'd slit old Boudreaux's throat all those years ago, Étienne felt something he hadn't felt in decades: fear. Not fear of prison, he'd die before he let himself be caged. Fear of losing everything he'd built. Fear of being remembered as just another criminal who got caught. Fear that his empire, his legacy, would crumble to nothing while he hid in the swamp like a common fugitive. But Étienne LaSalle hadn't gotten where he was by giving up when things got difficult. If anything, adversity sharpened him, brought out the qualities that had made him so dangerous in the first place. He began planning his response to the federal prosecution with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd brought to building his empire. He couldn't fight the federal government directly, but he could undermine their case, eliminate their witnesses, and make the cost of pursuing him so high that maybe, just maybe, they'd decide it wasn't worth it, that it was a desperate strategy, and Étienne knew it. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and these were desperate times indeed. The serpent's shadow had fallen across his empire, and Étienne would either find a way to strike back or be crushed beneath it. The question was, how much blood would it take to save himself? And was there any amount of blood that would be enough? Cornered animal is always dangerous, and in 1930, Étienne LaSalle was very much cornered. Federal agents were systematically dismantling his organization. Witnesses were lining up to testify against him, and his safe havens were shrinking by the day. A lesser man might have fled the country, disappeared to Mexico or South America to live out his days in exile. But Étienne wasn't a lesser man, and he wasn't ready to concede defeat. His counterattack began with Ebert. The smuggler turned informant was the federal government's star witness, the man whose testimony could directly link Étienne to criminal activity. Killing him would be difficult. He was under constant federal protection, moved between safe houses randomly, and never appeared in public. But difficult wasn't the same as impossible, and Étienne had resources that few criminals could match. He put a price on Ebert's head, $50,000, an astronomical sum in 1930. The word went out through the underworld, and bounty hunters, hitmen, and desperate criminals across the South began searching for the protected witness. It took 3 months, But eventually, someone got lucky. A corrupt clerk in the U.S. Marshal's office leaked Hebert's location for a cut of the reward. On a rainy April night, two of Étienne's best killers staged an ambush outside a safe house. In rural Mississippi, the attack was swift and professional. The federal marshals guarding Hebert never had a chance. 4 marshals died in the initial assault, and Hebert was dragged from the house and executed in the muddy driveway. The killers escaped into the night, and though the authorities suspected LaSalle's involvement, they could never prove it. Hebert was dead, and with him died much of the federal government's case, but killing a federal witness and 4 U.S. marshals brought consequences that even Étienne hadn't fully anticipated. The Justice Department, which had been treating the LaSalle case as just another prohibition prosecution, now elevated it to the highest priority. J. Edgar Hoover himself, director of the Bureau of Investigation, took a personal interest. Additional agents were assigned. The budget was increased. And most ominously for Étienne, the investigation expanded beyond prohibition violations to include murder, racketeering, and corruption. Thomas Brennan, devastated by Hebert's murder and the deaths of the marshals, became even more determined. He began building a new case. This one focused not on prohibition violations, but on the murders Étienne had ordered. Bodies started being exhumed from the bayou, forensic evidence was collected, and witnesses who'd been too afraid to come forward before were offered protection and incentives. Meanwhile, Étienne's empire was crumbling from within. The heat from federal investigations made business nearly impossible. Suppliers didn't want to deal with him anymore, too afraid of being caught. Up in the dragnet, speakeasy owners were closing their doors or switching to other suppliers. His smuggling routes were compromised, his warehouses were being raided, and his men were being arrested faster than he could replace them. The money, which had once flowed like water, slowed to a trickle. Étienne had always paid his men well. It was part of what bought their loyalty, but now he had to cut salaries and benefits. This created resentment and instability within an organization that was already fracturing under pressure. Men who'd been loyal when times were good started looking for exits when times got bad, and times were getting very bad. By the summer of 1930, Étienne was essentially a prisoner in the bayou, unable to leave his increasingly small circle of safe territory without risking arrest. He'd aged visibly in the months since the indictment, his hair going gray, his face developing lines that hadn't been there before. The stress of maintaining an empire while being hunted was taking its toll. It was during this period that Étienne made what would be his final fatal mistake. He decided to make an example of Thomas Brennan. Killing a federal agent was considered suicidal by most criminals, but Étienne reasoned that Brennan's death would send an unmistakable message. Nobody was untouchable, and the cost of pursuing Étienne LaSalle was death. He also believed, incorrectly, that with Brennan dead, the federal investigation would lose momentum and potentially collapse entirely. The plan was elaborate. Brennan was careful, professional, and well-guarded, but everyone has routines, and everyone makes mistakes eventually. Étienne's men spent weeks surveilling Brennan, learning his habits, identifying vulnerabilities. They discovered that every Sunday, Brennan attended Mass at a Catholic church in the Garden District. He went alone, believing that even LaSalle wouldn't dare attack him in a church. On a humid Sunday morning in August 1930, Étienne's men made their move. They didn't attack Brennan in the church. Even Étienne had limits, but they waited for him to exit. As Brennan walked down the church steps, greeting the priest and parishioners, two men approached from different directions. They pulled out pistols and opened fire. What happened next became confused in the telling. Multiple witnesses gave conflicting accounts. What's clear is that Brennan was hit at least twice, fell on the church steps, and continued to return fire even while wounded. His shots hit one of the assassins, who fled bleeding and was later found dead in an alley. The second assassin was tackled by members of the congregation and held for police. Brennan survived. The bullets had missed his vital organs, and he was rushed to a hospital where surgeons saved his life. As he recovered, the attempted assassination became national news. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the brave federal agent who'd been gunned down outside a church. The public was outraged. Politicians called for action. And J. Edgar Hoover, who'd already made the LaSalle case a priority, now made it his personal mission to see Étienne destroyed. The assassin who'd been captured was a man named Dessette, one of Étienne's longtime enforcers. Under interrogation, he initially refused to talk, but facing the death penalty for attempting to murder a federal officer, he eventually broke. He gave the FBI everything: safe house locations, names of LaSalle associates, details of the organization's structure, and most damaging of all, direct testimony that Étienne LaSalle had personally ordered Brennan's assassination, with Dessette's testimony. The federal government now had enough evidence to pursue not just prohibition charges, but attempted murder of a federal officer, which carried the death penalty. Every law enforcement agency in the South mobilized to find Étienne. The bayou, once his fortress, became his prison. Federal agents cordoned off the area, setting up checkpoints on every road and waterway leading out. They brought in boats, airplanes, and local guides who knew the swamp. The net was tightening, and this time there would be no escape. Étienne, holed up in a cabin deep in the bayou with only a handful of loyal men left, finally began to understand what he'd done to himself. In his arrogance and desperation, he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He'd tried to kill a federal agent, and now the full weight of the United States government was being brought to bear against him. His empire was gone. His money was running out. His men were abandoning him. And the swamp that had protected him for so long was becoming his tomb. On a hot September night, sitting on the porch of his cabin with a bottle of rum and a loaded pistol, Étienne LaSalle took stock of his life. He'd started with nothing and built an empire. He'd commanded fear and respect across the South. He'd killed his enemies and crushed anyone who opposed him. He'd achieved everything he'd set out to achieve, and now it was all ashes. The empire was gone. The respect was gone. The fear remained, but it had turned inward now. Étienne was the one who was afraid. Afraid of capture, afraid of trial, afraid of the rope or the electric chair that surely awaited him. The price of power, Étienne realized too late, was everything. You could gain the whole world, but you'd lose yourself in the process. You'd lose your humanity, your connections, everything that made life worth living. You'd end up alone in a swamp, hunted and desperate, wondering if it had all been worth it. Étienne took a long drink of rum and watched the moon rise over the black water. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of search parties, boats motoring through channels, dogs barking, men calling to each other. They were getting closer. Soon, very soon, they'd find him. And when they did, Étienne LaSalle would have to make a choice: surrender and face justice, or go out fighting the way he'd lived. It wasn't a difficult choice. Étienne had never surrendered to anything in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. He checked his pistol, making sure it was fully loaded. Then he sat back and waited for dawn and the reckoning that would come with it. Asterisk, asterisk. The final manhunt for Étienne LaSalle lasted 3 weeks and became the largest law enforcement operation in Louisiana history. Over 200 federal agents, state police, and local deputies combed through the bayou, searching for a man who'd become more myth than human. The newspapers covered it like a war, with daily updates on the search's progress and speculation about how it would end. Thomas Brennan, recovered enough to leave the hospital against his doctor's orders, insisted on being part of the operation. He wore a bandage under his shirt where the bullets had struck him, and every movement caused pain, but he refused to stay behind. This was his case, his mission, and he wanted to be there when LaSalle was finally brought to justice. Étienne's remaining loyalists, never more than a dozen men, were hunted down one by one. Some surrendered peacefully, relieved that their ordeal was ending. Others fought back and were killed in shootouts with federal agents. A few simply disappeared into the bayou, choosing to become fugitives rather than face prosecution. Within a week, Étienne was down to just 3 men, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they were caught too. The cabin where Étienne was hiding had been his father's before him, or so he told himself. The truth was, he'd never known his father, had no idea if the man was even still alive. But the cabin had been his refuge for years, a place he came to when he needed to disappear, to think, to remember who he'd been before the empire and the violence and the money. Now it would be his last stand. On September 23, 1930, federal agents finally closed in on Étienne's location. A local fisherman, tempted by the reward money, had reported seeing smoke from a cabin deep in a particularly isolated section of the bayou. Brennan led a team of 20 agents through the swamp in the pre-dawn darkness, moving as quietly as possible, hoping to catch LaSalle before he could escape or mount a defense. But Étienne wasn't caught unaware. He'd set up sentries, tripwires, and alarm systems throughout the area around the cabin. When the federal agents were still a quarter-mile away, bells rang and one of Étienne's men came running to alert him. Étienne checked his weapons, 2 pistols and a rifle, and sent his 3 remaining men to defensive positions. He knew this was the end, but he'd be damned if he'd make it easy for them. As the sun rose over the bayou, turning the morning mist gold and pink, the shooting started. The federal agents announced themselves, called for Étienne to surrender. Peacefully. Étienne's response was a rifle shot that splintered a tree inches from Brennan's head. The message was clear. There would be no surrender. What followed was a siege that lasted most of the day. Étienne and his men were outnumbered more than 6 to 1, but they had the advantage of position and they knew the terrain. They picked off agents who got too close, forced the federal forces to take cover, and made every yard of advance cost dearly. 2 agents were wounded in the first hour, and the assault bogged down as Brennan realized that a frontal assault would lead to unacceptable casualties. Instead, Brennan settled in for a siege. He positioned snipers to keep Étienne's men pinned down, brought up additional forces to completely surround the cabin, and waited for thirst, hunger, or ammunition to force a surrender. It was a patient, professional approach, and it drove Étienne crazy. This wasn't how the story was supposed to end. Étienne LaSalle, the Bayou Butcher, scourge of the Gulf Coast, wasn't supposed to be starved out like a rat in a hole. He was supposed to go out in a blaze of glory, guns blazing, taking as many enemies with him as possible. But as the hours dragged on and the federal noose tightened, even Étienne had to admit that the game was over. His 3 remaining men knew it too. As night fell on the first day of the siege, one of them approached Étienne. "Boss," he said quietly, "we could try to break out after dark. Maybe make it to a boat." "There's no boats left," Étienne interrupted. "They've got the whole area surrounded. Even if we made it to the water, where would we go? They'll just chase us down. Then what do we do?" Étienne was silent for a long moment, staring out at the darkness where hundreds of armed men waited for him. "You 3 are going to surrender at first light," he finally said. "Tell them I forced you to stay, that you wanted to give up. They might go easy on you." "What? About you?" "I'm not going to prison," Étienne said flatly. "I'd rather die here, on my own terms, than rot in a cell or dance at the end of a rope." The 3 men argued with him, but Étienne's mind was made up. He'd made many decisions in his life, most of them ruthless and violent, but this one felt right. He'd lived by the gun, and he'd die by the gun. It was fitting somehow. Poetic, even as dawn broke on the second day. Étienne's 3 men walked out of the cabin with their hands up, surrendering to the federal agents. Brennan questioned them briefly, confirming that Étienne was alone in the cabin, armed and refusing to surrender. Brennan then made one final attempt to end this peacefully. Using a bullhorn, he called out to Étienne, "LaSalle, you're alone. There's no escape. Come out with your hands up, and I give you my word you'll make it to trial alive." Étienne's laugh echoed across the water. "Your word, Brennan? What's that worth? You think I'm afraid of dying? Asterisk, asterisk. I think you're smarter than this. You've got no play left. Don't throw your life away." "My life," Étienne called back. "My life ended the day you started hunting me. Everything I built, everything I was, it's all gone. All I've got left is how I go out, and I'm going out my way." There was genuine sadness in Brennan's voice when he responded, "It didn't have to be this way." "Yes, it did," Étienne said, and his voice was calm now, almost peaceful. "From the moment I killed Boudreaux when I was 14, it was always going to end like this. I just didn't know it yet." Brennan gave Étienne 1 more hour to reconsider. When that hour passed with no surrender, he gave the order to assault the cabin. Under covering fire from snipers and rifles, agents advanced from multiple directions. Étienne met them with everything he had, firing methodically, conserving ammunition, making every shot count. But one man can't fight off an army, no matter how skilled or determined. The agents reached the cabin, smashed through the windows, tossed in tear gas grenades. Étienne, choking and blinded, kept firing even as his position became untenable. He killed 1 agent and wounded 2 others in those final minutes, fighting with a ferocity born of desperation and rage and the knowledge that this was his last act on earth. When the shooting finally stopped and the tear gas cleared, federal agents entered the cabin to find Étienne LaSalle slumped against the wall, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds. His pistol had fallen from his hand empty. He was still alive, barely, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Brennan entered the cabin and knelt beside the dying gangster. For a moment, the two men who'd been locked in mortal combat for over a year just looked at each other, the idealistic lawman and the amoral criminal, both products of their times, both doing what they believed was right. "You got me," Étienne said, blood bubbling on his lips. "Hope it was worth it." "It was my job," Brennan replied. "Just following orders, huh?" Étienne coughed, a harsh, wet sound. "That's what we all say, isn't it? Me, we're not so different. You just had the law on your side." "We're very different," Brennan said firmly. "I never killed innocent people." Étienne's laugh turned into another coughing fit. "Innocent? Brennan, there's no such thing. We're all guilty of something." Those were Étienne LaSalle's last words. He died in that cabin in the bayou, surrounded by the men who'd hunted him, far from the empire he'd built and the power he'd wielded. The Bayou Butcher was dead at age 39, killed in a shootout. With federal agents, his empire in ruins, and his legacy written in blood, the newspapers trumpeted it as a great victory for law and order. Politicians praised the federal agents' courage and dedication. J. Edgar Hoover used the successful conclusion of the LaSalle case to argue for expanded federal law enforcement powers. Thomas Brennan was decorated as a hero and promoted, though he'd carry the physical and psychological scars of the case for the rest of his life. Étienne's body was claimed by no one. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a Louisiana cemetery, attended by no mourners, missed by no one who'd known him. His son, raised by a family in Texas, never learned his father's true identity, growing up to become an accountant who lived a quiet, law-abiding life. Everything his father hadn't been. The empire Étienne had built collapsed completely within months of his death. His lieutenants either went to prison or scattered to other parts of the country. His smuggling routes were shut down. His speakeasies were raided and closed. Within a year, it was as if the LaSalle organization had never existed, but the legend persisted. In the bars and back rooms of Louisiana, people still told stories about the Bayou Butcher, the man who'd ruled the swamp with an iron fist, who'd built an empire on rum and violence, who'd lived and died by his own rules. The stories grew in the telling, becoming more myth than history, until Étienne LaSalle became a sort of dark folk hero, reminder of a lawless time when men could carve out their own kingdoms if they were ruthless enough and smart enough, and lucky enough, at least, until their luck ran out. ****. The death of Étienne LaSalle should have been the end of the story, but in many ways it was just the beginning of his real legacy. Because the tale of the Bayou Butcher wasn't just about one man's rise and fall, it was about what he left behind. The scars he carved into Louisiana's landscape, and the lessons learned from his blood-soaked empire. In the immediate aftermath of Étienne's death, there was a power vacuum in Louisiana's criminal underworld. Dozens of smaller operators tried to fill the void he'd left, but none had his vision or ruthlessness. The federal government, emboldened by their success against LaSalle, cracked down hard on organized crime throughout the South. Within 2 years, Prohibition-era bootlegging in Louisiana had been largely eliminated or driven so far underground that it ceased to be a major enterprise. But Étienne's real legacy wasn't his criminal empire, it was what he'd proven was possible. Before LaSalle, most criminals in Louisiana were small-time operators, running penny-ante scams and local rackets. Étienne showed that with enough ambition and brutality, you could build something much larger, something that touched multiple states and generated millions of dollars. He created a blueprint that future criminals would study and refine. The Marcello crime family, the same organization that Vincent Marcello had been part of when he challenged Étienne, eventually rose to dominate organized crime in Louisiana for much of the 20th century. They learned from LaSalle's mistakes. They stayed more subtle, cultivated better political connections, and never attracted the level of federal attention that had brought Étienne down. But make no mistake, they were walking a path that Étienne had first blazed through the Bayou. Thomas Brennan, the agent who'd hunted LaSalle to his death, never quite recovered from the experience. He continued working for the Bureau of Investigation, rising through the ranks and pursuing other cases. But colleagues said he was different after the LaSalle case, harder, more cynical, haunted by what he'd seen and done in the Bayou. He retired in 1945, moved to a quiet town in Virginia, and rarely spoke about his time in Louisiana. When he died in 1958, his obituary mentioned the LaSalle case only briefly, though it had defined his career and his life. The people whose lives Étienne had touched, the families of his victims, the communities his violence had terrorized. The law enforcement officers he'd corrupted or killed carried their own scars. In some parishes of Louisiana, even decades later, people spoke of the LaSalle years in hushed tones, the way you might speak of a natural disaster or a plague. He'd been a force of nature, they said, and you didn't judge a hurricane, you just tried to survive it. Marie Broussard, the woman who'd betrayed Étienne with Jacques Thibodeau, took the money he'd given her and fled to Chicago. She remarried, took a new name, and lived into the 1960s, never telling anyone about her past with the Bayou Butcher. On her deathbed, she reportedly asked a priest for forgiveness for what she'd done, though she never specified whether she meant her affair with Jacques or her years with Étienne or all of it together. Étienne's son, the boy he'd sent away to Texas, grew up never knowing his father's true identity. The family that raised him told him his parents had died in an accident, and he had no reason to question it. He became an accountant, married, had children of his own, and lived a quiet, respectable life. It wasn't until the 1970s when he was going through old papers after his adoptive mother's death that he discovered the truth about who his father had been. The discovery devastated him, but he chose to keep the secret, never telling his own children that their grandfather had been one of America's most notorious gangsters. The Bayou itself, Étienne's fortress and final resting place, slowly reclaimed the evidence of his empire. The cabins and safe houses rotted and collapsed into the black water. The channels he'd used for smuggling grew over with vegetation. Within a generation, you could travel through the areas where Étienne had ruled and find no trace that he'd ever existed, no markers, no monuments, nothing but the natural landscape that had witnessed so much violence and now held its secrets beneath dark waters. But the stories persisted. In Louisiana bars and barbershops, people still told tales about the Bayou Butcher. The stories grew in the telling, becoming more elaborate and less accurate, until it was hard to separate fact from fiction. Some said Étienne had hidden treasure. Somewhere in the bayou, millions in cash and gold that was never recovered. Others claimed his ghost still haunted the swamp, that you could see his shadowy figure on foggy nights, forever searching for the empire he'd lost. Still others said he hadn't really died at all, that the man killed in the cabin was a decoy and the real Étienne LaSalle had escaped to Mexico or South America. None of these stories were true, but they revealed something important. Étienne LaSalle had become a legend, a mythic figure representing both the allure and the danger of the criminal life. He was proof that you could rise from nothing and build an empire through sheer will and ruthlessness. He was also proof that such empires were built on sand, destined to collapse and bury their builders. Historians and criminologists who studied the LaSalle case identified several key factors in his rise and fall. His success came from identifying an opportunity that others missed, the bayou as a smuggling route, being more ruthless than his competitors, and building a loyal organization through a combination of money and fear. His failure came from the same qualities that had driven his success: the ruthlessness that made him enemies, the paranoia that isolated him, and the ambition that eventually pushed him to cross lines that brought down overwhelming retaliation. The LaSalle case also influenced law enforcement strategy. The federal government's success in bringing down Étienne's organization became a model for future RICO cases against organized crime. The tactics used turning low-level criminals against their bosses, building cases patiently from the bottom up, using federal resources to overcome local corruption, would be refined and reused against the mafia, drug cartels, and other criminal enterprises for decades to come. But perhaps Étienne LaSalle's greatest legacy was what he represented: the dark side of the American dream. He was an immigrant's son who pulled himself up from poverty through ambition and hard work. Except his work was crime, and his ambition led to the deaths of dozens of people. He achieved success beyond what most people could imagine, accumulating wealth and power that rivaled legitimate businessmen. But it all came at a cost that eventually consumed him. There's a question that hangs over Étienne's story, one that each person has to answer for themselves. Was it worth it? If you could live like a king for a decade, but knew you'd die young and violent, would you take that bargain? Étienne did, and he paid the price. He built his empire on blood and watched it crumble to ashes. He trusted no one and died alone. He had everything and died with nothing. The bayou, indifferent to human ambition and human suffering, continues flowing as it always has. The cypress trees still stand silent witness to secrets buried in the black water. And somewhere in Louisiana, in an unmarked grave, lie the bones of Étienne LaSalle, the Bayou Butcher, the man who wanted to be a king and ended up just another corpse. His empire is gone. His name is mostly forgotten except by historians and true crime enthusiasts. His son and grandchildren live normal lives, never speaking the name LaSalle. Everything he built has turned to dust. But the story remains, and maybe that's the point. Maybe the story itself is the legacy, not as a celebration of Étienne's life, but as a warning. The criminal life promises power and wealth and freedom from society's rules. What it delivers is paranoia, violence, betrayal, and early death. The throne Étienne fought so hard to claim turned out to be made of quicksand, and it swallowed him whole. In the end, the bayou always wins. It's patient, timeless, and it remembers nothing. It took everything Étienne gave it, the blood, the bodies, the secrets, and it absorbed it all without judgment. The black water continues to flow, the gators continue to hunt, and the fog continues to roll thick over the swamp, just as it did before Étienne was born, and as it will, long after everyone who remembers his name is dead. That's the real legacy of the Bayou Butcher. Not the empire he built, or the money he made, or the people he killed, but the reminder that all empires fall, all kings die, and all that remains is the story. And even that, eventually, fades into legend, and then into myth, and then into nothing at all. The darkness of the bayou keeps its secrets well. Étienne LaSalle is one of them now, another ghost in the shadows. Another warning written in blood and forgotten by time. Asterisk. And so ends the dark saga of Étienne LaSalle, Louisiana's Bayou Butcher, a man who rose from nothing, built an empire on blood and ambition, and paid the ultimate price for his ruthless pursuit of power. His story is a reminder that the criminal life, no matter how glamorous it might seem from the outside, leads down a one-way path to destruction. If you found yourself drawn into this tale of empire and betrayal, of ambition and downfall, then make sure to subscribe to this channel for more stories from the shadows of history. Hit that like button if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, and drop a comment below telling me which part of Étienne's story affected you the most. Was it his lonely childhood that shaped him into a monster? His brutal rise to power? The betrayal that cut him deepest? Or his final, desperate stand against impossible odds? The underworld is full of stories like this men and women who lived by their own rules, built empires in the shadows, and left legacies written in blood. If you want to hear more of these tales, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because every week we descend into the darkness to bring you another story that history tried to forget. Remember, the men who build empires on violence and fear always end up the same way, alone, hunted and facing a death they can't escape. The bayou remembers. History remembers. And now, so do you. Until next time, stay safe out there. The shadows are full of stories, and some of them are more terrifying than any fiction could ever be.